Is my attire okay? I didn't wear anything special.
Okay, that's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Okay, so let's start. Today is June 18th, 1999, and we're in London, and it's right after the 60th Kinder Transport Reunion. So, let's see, do I have to keep pressing the button? No, good. Okay. So, can you start by giving your name and spelling it?
My name is Felix Weil. It's spelled Felix. Last name is Weil.
Okay, and where do you live?
I live in Dayton, Ohio, USA.
Okay.
Do I need to look in the camera?
It's better if you look in the camera.
Okay.
You can stand it.
Sure.
Okay, so since I'm not terribly experienced, we'll more or less go through questions here, but if you take off on tangents, that's okay.
All right.
If you have interesting stories, which I'm sure you do.
Okay.
Okay. So where and when were you born?
I was born December the 12th, 1927 in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. And I lived in, should I go on?
Keep going.
Okay, I lived in Germany until August the 10th, 1939. I lived with my mother and father and my sister. My father had a textile wholesale business in Frankfurt, and we lived a very normal life until the Hitler era. We lived on the west side of Frankfurt, and we belonged to the West End Synagogue, which was a very prominent congregation in Frankfurt. The first years of my school life, I went to a mixed school. By mixed, I mean Gentile and Jewish. And, of course, the things changed in approximately 1937, when Jewish kids were no longer allowed to attend regular schools. By regular, I mean mixed schools, actually. And then I had to go, first I went to a private school for a few months, which was kind of disastrous. And then I went to the Philanthropine, which is an extremely well-known Jewish school, an excellent school that had existed for many, many years in Frankfurt. Chances I would not have gone to that school and would have gone to a mixed school if it hadn't been for the Hitler era. My father lost his business in 1938, and then he was at home. He lost it by Aryanism, which means Aryanization of the business. He didn't lose it for any other reason, and he got practically nothing for the business. It was extremely painful for him because he had started the business from scratch, and it was a very prospering business, and then just to have it taken away from him, and he was no longer a young man. It was very harmful, not harmful, but hurtful, I should say, to his well-being. My parents had originally thought that this would all blow over, that Hitler would be deposed in a matter of a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, and that things would return to normal. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and they didn't really want to leave Germany. As I say, my parents were getting on in years, and my father had no idea of what kind of work, since he had his own business, he would be able to do in a foreign country. He didn't speak any English, and so they thought they would be able to just weather the storm. But by 1938, Kristallnacht, November 1938, I'm sure everyone knows about it, they realized that their chance of, they had an application for a visa for the United States, but the number was so extremely high that they realized that they're getting out of Germany within a short period of time was very unreal thinking, was impossible. Impossible. What they then did is register my sister and me for Kindertransport.
And did you have other siblings?
Yes, I had a sister.
I said other. You had
Oh,
one-
no, I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. No, I only had one sister.
And she older or
She was
younger?
2.5 years older than I am.
Okay. And also, what were your parents' names?
Ludwig and Linda.
Okay. And where and when were they born?
My father was born in a little town near Freiburg called Sulzburg, and lately I found a book about archives in Sulzburg. It was a very small, prominent Jewish community going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And this book details, and there's awful lot of Weils listed in that book, but I haven't been able to come up with any relationship at this point yet. Maybe there's. I'm trying to reach it. My mother was born in Frankfurt. Her maiden name was Herzfeld. And my father had moved to Frankfurt before he got married, and they got married in Frankfurt.
And did anyone else live with you besides your parents and your sister?
No, not until the last few months or perhaps a year, when we took in a room, a person that was rented out a room. We had a very large apartment, and of course by then money was beginning to get tight, and my parents took in a room in one of the rooms. But normally, under normal circumstances, there were no other family members other than the four of us living together.
And you call it a close family?
Yes, very close. We got along extremely well, and we attended services fairly often, not every Shabbat, but quite often. My parents weren't too religious. We were more what in Germany they called in those days liberal and not Orthodox Jews.
And were your parents' friends Jewish or mixed?
All Jewish.
All Jewish.
Yes. He had a few people, my father had a few of his sales representatives that were Gentile working in his business, and of course they came occasionally to our house where they had business discussions with my father. But basically our friends were all Jewish, and very few non-Jewish friends that I know of.
And what do you remember, what were religious holidays like for you? Any particular memories?
The high holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I distinctly remember that my father, when he attended services, wore a high hat and tails. It was very formal. And our synagogue was one of the most beautiful synagogues that I've ever seen in my whole lifetime since then. Maybe it's because I was used to it that I found it so beautiful, but the services were very well conducted, and they had an organ. As I said, it was a liberal congregation, and that particular synagogue, they had 3 rabbis, and it was a large congregation, and I used to go with my father to services, and my mother and sister used to sit up in the balcony, and I always would turn around and wave to my sister or make faces at her and try and get her to laugh and cut up. And they had a huge, beautiful chandelier, and when I got bored with services, I was only a young kid, you have to remember I was only 11 when I left Germany, I would try to count all the bulbs in the chandelier. I remember these things very well.
How high did you get?
I don't remember, but I did sit with my father, and I did learn the hymns and songs and some of the prayers, and I was very much impressed with the services.
Okay.
They were very structured, and nowadays the services that I go to are much more, and this may be just a change of time, and things would have changed there possibly too. For instance, participation of younger people, children and families, was never done in those days. Anyhow, can I go back to Kristallnacht?
Yes.
Okay. Kristallnacht was, of course, November 9th, 10th, 1938. And I remember bicycling to my school on that morning of November, what date did I say? Did I say November? Maybe I did. Yes,
November.
It's supposed to be, I should have said November if I didn't. And I remember cycling past our synagogue and it was on fire. And I remember, of course, I had no idea what was happening, and I remember seeing the firemen hosing down the buildings on either side of the synagogue to make sure that nothing would catch fire, but they, of course, made no attempt to stop the fires in the synagogue. As a matter of fact, the synagogue, the shell, the outside shell survived, which in itself is something rare. The inside was completely destroyed. All the artifacts, the Torah scrolls, everything was thrown in the streets and destroyed, of course. But the shell remained, and in the subsequent years when Jews came back to Frankfurt after the war, these were mostly Russian and Eastern European Jews that found work in Frankfurt. They reconstructed the inside. It was never again the same as what it was before, but it is in operation nowadays, and it's still being used. Anyhow, going back to Kristallnacht, I went to school, and everyone was standing around in the courtyard, in the schoolyard, and we were told to go home immediately. There wouldn't be any school that day. We knew something terrible was happening. We didn't know exactly what, and of course we had no idea of the scope of what was happening. That it was all over Germany, and it wasn't just in Frankfurt. And when I came home, I remember my father had some inkling, but he had no idea of what was going on. You have to remember in those days there was no such thing as television, and the radio was completely, whatever they said on the radio was Nazi controlled anyway. There was no way of knowing the truth. And they said on the radio that German people were terribly distraught about the murder of the second secretary of the German embassy in Paris, and they were taking their revenge on the Jews, and this was being done all over all over the country, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, we went out for a walk, I remember that very well, and we were accosted by two SS officers, and they told my father that didn't he know that Jews were not permitted on the streets that day, and that he could be arrested immediately and sent to a concentration camp. And it's a miracle that they didn't do that, and they told us to go home. So, of course, we went home. That was the beginning of things getting really bad. The pogrom in 1938, Kristallnacht. As I mentioned before, I think that my parents, realizing at that point that their hope of getting out of Germany was very small, was almost nil, they registered my sister and me for the Kindertransport. And we heard nothing until the 10th of August, 1939. And that is actually 3 weeks before war broke out in Europe. War broke out on the 1st of September when Germany invaded Poland. The official war with Britain and France occurred on the 3rd of September 1939. But anyhow, by the 1st of September, we got notification that I was to be ready by the 10th of August. I'm sorry, I made a mistake again. By the 1st of August, we got notification that I was to be ready by the 10th of August. In other words, we had 10 days to get ready for me to be on the Kindertransport. There was no notification for my sister, and my mother was concerned, and my father too, of course, and wondering why it was me and not both of us, and not her. She was older than I am, so on and so forth. But in those days, you didn't question anything. You did what you were told, and if I was to be ready, they made sure I was ready, because no one wanted to take a chance that by questioning her not going, that I would lose my chance. And I'll explain to you in a minute what happened. So we frantically did our shopping in those 10 days, and my mother bought everything for me that I might need in the years to come. anything from toothpaste to shirts and pants in various sizes. I was only 11 years old and I was still growing, and suits and underwear, whatever a little kid might need for many years to come. And getting ready for this trip and then going on the trip, for me it was a big adventure. At least these are the thoughts I have now. I probably have closed out the bad thoughts, because it's very easy to remember good things and not bad things in your life. And as I said, to me it was an adventure. First of all, I had absolutely no knowledge of what was really happening. I was only an 11-year-old kid. Yes, I knew about the Nazis. Yes, I knew we couldn't sit on certain park benches and we had to go to Jewish schools. But you go about your business as a young kid and you really don't worry about these things as long as you have your parents and as long as you live with them and as long as you have 3 meals on the table and you have your room and your bed and everything else. So these are things your parents are supposed to take off, not a 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid. And I had been away many times during the summers to summer camps, Kinderheims they call them in Germany. And being away from home, I was quite used to that. Am I talking too much?
No, I'm just checking to make sure everything's going
okay.
fine.
So having to go away, and of course in my mind, my parents told me they would be seeing me in a couple of months when all their business and everything they had to clear up in Germany would be done. They would follow me to England. And I had, of course, no reason not to believe them. I'd never been lied to by them before. I'm quite sure my parents weren't so sure about this going. In fact, they were probably sure it wasn't, but they weren't going to tell me that. So I felt this was going to be a big trip and lots of kids and a new country and new people, and I'm only going to be away for a month or two without them, and then we'd all get together, so it's going to be great fun, wonderful experience. By the 10th of August, I'll never forget, my mother sat on my bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, and she was crying, and she probably realized that there's a good possibility that she might never see me again. As I say, I had no idea of this whatsoever, and I got ready to go, and an hour or two I was ready, and we left for train station and got on the train. I got on the train. They didn't get on, and I saw them they came to the train station with me. And of course, by then they were all crying, and I don't remember if I was crying or not, but I probably was. But it was going to be a big adventure to go on this trip, and I would see them again very soon, and so we left. When we got to the border between Holland and Germany, 2 SS troopers came in the train, and the first thing they made a big announcement and told us that once we would leave Germany, we would never ever be permitted to come back. And a big hooray and screaming went up, and everybody was cheering and yelling, we don't want to come back anyway. And I often wonder that they let us get away with this and not take any reprisals or send us all back or shoot us or whatever terrible thing they might have. Anyhow, we all got out. But little did I realize at that point that 7 years, almost to the identical day, I would be back in Germany in an American Army uniform. I was drafted when I came here in the Army. And of course, I had no way of knowing that I would wind up in the United States. And so I had no way of knowing that I would be back in Germany, whether the SS liked it or not, but under different circumstances. And from there we went to Hoek van Holland. All the kids, all the people that were here this week, everybody talks about Hoek van Holland and the ferry boat, and everybody got seasick, and we all went to Harwich, from Hoek van Holland to Harwich.
What's Harwich?
Harwich is a port in the English Channel, the English port, where we arrived the next morning. It was an overnight trip. Nowadays you can go through the tunnel in 45 minutes in your car, or a bus or train from Calais to Dover. In those days there was no tunnel, and the only way you got across the channel was by a ferry boat. And it was very rough. It's always rough, and everybody always got seasick. So the next morning we arrived in Harwich, and they gave us breakfast. And I'm talking to other people this week, and it's amazing how similar our remembrances are. For instance, I remember getting white bread, and we all looked at that white bread and wondered what on earth that is. In Germany, no one had ever eaten any white bread. It was always rye bread, dark bread, pumpernickel, all kinds of stuff. No one ever had any white bread. So this was the first of many surprises that we were, believe me, it was a very minor thing. Anyhow, they put us on a train from Harwich to, we talked about again this week. I was trying to find people that had been on my transport, but I couldn't, because it's very strange. My transport was the one before the last. There was only one other transport after mine that left Germany because the war broke out by the 1st of September. This was already the 11th of August. And we went to London. And when we arrived in London, all the kids were being taken off the train by friends or relatives, or were sent to hostels or somewhere. They had arrangements had been made for all these kids to be taken somewhere. And I couldn't remember anyone telling me anything as to what would happen to me. No one had told me. So I was the last child left on this platform, train platform, and no one was picking me up. And finally, these people that had organized the transport, Bloomsbury House, B'nai B'rith, or whatever, one of these organizations, came over to me, and they had supervised all these kids being picked up. They asked me my name, and I told them it's Felix Weil, and they looked through their lists, and there was no such person on the list. But they did find there was a girl by the name of Felicia Weil.
Is that your sister?
No, it's not my sister. It was Henny Weil. But there was someone else that was supposed to have been on the transport, and somehow there was a mistake that had been made. And I took the place of this young lady that was supposed to have been on this transport. And so it's by sheer accident, by the grace of God, that I'm here today and even telling you the story. Because if not, I would have been in the gas chambers in the crematorium with the rest of my family. I'm the only member of my family that survived. So this is very strange. And we've often tried to find what happened to this girl, Felicia Weil, and we know she got out of Germany. There are some records indicating she got to Belgium on another transport. What happened to her after that, no one knows. So the next thing was, what should they do with me? Because by that time, this was now only a couple of weeks before the war started, and people were very busy in London, and they were too busy worrying about a little 11-year-old kid. So they sent me to a hostel, an all-girls hostel in Willesden Lane. And I've met some of the people here that were in this hostel at the same time I was there. And I tried to ask them if they remember. No one remembered me. I was a little boy. I was the only boy, only an 11-year-old kid wandering around there. And they probably thought I was a relative of somebody. And some of the girls finally got to know me, but very few. And they were very kind to me. After all, I was only 11 years old, and they didn't have to worry about an 11-year-old boy. So anyway, I stayed there.
Did everybody speak German?
Yes, everybody spoke German. They were all German girls, and they were all either going to school or working. They were in their late teens, early 20s, something like that. And it was a beautiful place. I remember the gardens. I used to be very bored there. I was the only kid there all day long. Everybody else was gone during the day. But then by the 1st of September, we were all evacuated. You might have heard about that in London. All the kids, English kids, everybody, I'm not talking about...
Because of the bombing, right?
Because of the bombing that they anticipated to come, which didn't come for quite some time, of course, another year. But everybody that was still left, a lot of kids had been sent away to the United States or Canada, Australia, wherever people had friends or relatives, they had sent them away. But those kids that had no one were put on these evacuation trains to the Midlands or other parts of England that were out of the range of German bombers. So I had to get on another train. And this was even more weird because they were all English kids and we didn't speak a word of English. I met two other boys that were in the same boat that I was in. They couldn't speak any English. They came from Berlin. And we were sent to a little village in Northamptonshire. And again, I met here at the reunion lots of people, lots of ladies that were sent to Northampton. They must have been on the same train with me, but we were all sent to different little villages, different places. So happened I was sent to a little village called Little Houghton, which is about 3.5 miles from Northampton. And they put us in this big social hall, and people would select their children that they wanted to stay with them. And these two boys from Berlin were selected by a very nice lady who happened to realize they couldn't speak a word of English, and she spoke a very good German. So she thought, well, I'll make it a little bit easier for them because I can speak their language and I'll teach them English and they can help me with my German and so forth. Well, it so happened she was the daughter of a lady who had a most beautiful, huge, not even a home, I would almost call it an estate. They had very extremely well-to-do, and they had gardens and chauffeurs and tennis courts and horses, and it's just absolutely a fantastic place. And as they were leaving, be all right?
Yeah.
Okay, as they were leaving there, is this what you want to hear?
This is, oh yes.
Okay.
Just like to make sure everything's on and going. This is very interesting.
As we were leaving, she asked these two boys, by the way, do you know anyone? We have a very large home, she said to them, and we really could take another kid. You know, we might as well have 3. Why not? Why only 2? She was pleased with the 2 boys she got. She thought she would get 2 kids from London somewhere that were maybe not to her liking as much, and whatever. So anyway, the 2 boys said, we met another kid on the train who's in the same predicament we are in. He doesn't speak a word of English. He's standing over there in the corner. Why don't we made friends with him. Why don't we take him? That happened to be me. And that's how I got into this wonderful home. Living away from your parents for a long period of time is not the same. I mean, they did everything for us they possibly could, but you still miss your family. It's not the same as living with your mother and father. But they were the kindest people that you could possibly imagine. They paid for our education. We went to public school. In England, public school is private school.
Oh.
And after the age of 14, schools have to be paid for. So we went to public school, or grammar school, whatever you want to call it. They took care of paying for our education. They took care of all our needs, our clothing and medical and dental needs, took us to dentists and doctors and whatever. And they had very little money coming in from they got some money from these various organizations, but nowhere near as to what their expenses for us was. They did everything for us they would do for their own grandchildren. I shouldn't say children because she was an older lady, but their grandchildren. They saw to it that we kept up our Jewish traditions. During the high holidays and Pesach and things like that, they would send us to a hostel in Northampton so that we also went to Sunday schools, Jewish Sunday school on Sunday morning. So we would have some semblance of Jewish heritage. I've heard so many cases where these Jewish kids that were refugees from Germany lost their entire Jewishness because they were in homes where either people were uncaring or deliberately tried to convert them. There were a lot of cases like that. Many of them lost it, and this was certainly not the case with us. At Christmas time, we would participate in getting gifts, having Christmas dinner, and doing all the things the other kids did. But we wouldn't attend church services. We'd never go to church. Sometimes we even asked, can't we go to church? We want to see what's going on. Under no circumstances did they want us to go to church with them. But they gave us all the niceties about Christmas so that we wouldn't feel ill at ease and uncomfortable that everybody's getting gifts and we didn't. And we bought with a few pennies or dollars, pounds that we had, bought everyone gifts too, of course. And it was just, we never felt that we were, I shouldn't even use the word discriminated, that it doesn't even enter, but even isolated or whatever you want to call it. We were part of the family. But it's still not the same as having your own family. But we loved our stay there, and we certainly, and I've been in contact with them all these years, so, and I'm still in contact with the family, so it's been like an ongoing thing. I heard from my family until late 1941.
How long did you live with them?
For 5.5 years, until 1945, when the war ended. And the way I heard from my mother and father was...
Oh, your family, your real family.
Real family, until 1941. I had relatives in the United States. My mother's sister and my mother's brother were living here. I mean, not here, I'm in London, I keep thinking. We're living in the United States. And the mail would... Before the United States got into the war, there was still mail service between Germany and the United States. And of course, there was always mail between the United States and Great Britain. So... mail would go to the United States and then send on to me in England, and it would take long months before I got letters. But I did hear from them, and everything was fine until 1941. And then, of course, it stopped. And, of course, it stopped because the war started with the United States. I had no way of knowing what happened to my family.
So everything, you got these letters, and then they suddenly just stopped.
Well, there's two reasons for stopping. First of all, the war started with the United States and Germany, so there was no mail service.
Right.
Secondly, they were deported at that time to Poland, to a ghetto called Lodz. And they were in the first transport of, there were 10,000 Jews remaining in Frankfurt when the war started. They were on that first transport taken to Poland, this terrible ghetto.
And but the whole family, both parents and
both parents and sisters, right. I had no way of knowing this. All I knew was that the war started with the United States, and there was no way I was going to hear from them, and I was hoping by the end of the war we would all be reunited. At the end of the war, of course, I learned the bitter truth. At the end of the war, I was then my aunt had me come to the United States. She wanted me there because we knew, of course, that my parents had died and had perished in the concentration camp. We had heard that my father had died at Lodz in the ghetto, but my mother and sister were they liquidated the ghettos, and by liquidated, of course, they were taken to the concentration camps. There were hundreds of thousands of people in this large ghetto, and I think they heard from 4 or 5 after the war. No one came out alive. Anyhow, when I came to the United States...
how old were you then?
I was 17. I was 17 in 1945. And I couldn't leave before because there was no transportation available. All transportation across the Atlantic was being used for military and troops and foodstuffs and military equipment and so forth. They didn't have very much transportation. So I stayed in England, which wasn't all that bad. Naturally, as I mentioned to you, I mean, I was in a wonderful home and well taken care of. And when I talked to some of the people here during this week, I realized how lucky I really was, because not everybody, or rather very few, had such wonderful stories as the kindness that I had, where a lot of kids were abused and were neglected and were worked hard and had to do terrible things, and they were shuffled around from one family to another in the time that we're here, and certainly didn't have the wonderful experience that I had living with these people. Anyhow, when I came to the United States, 1 year after I was here, I was drafted in the Army. And in those days, they needed troops to, this was 1946, the war was over. And I was in the Army, sent to right back to Germany, in the Army of Occupation. It wasn't even for language skills. They just needed me there. They needed people, lots of people in the occupation, both in Germany and Japan, of course. And so I wound up there. Where did they send me? Right back to Frankfurt, where I was born.
Was that coincidence or
Coincidence. No reasons. No particular reasons. I don't. If it was, I was never told. I don't think it was. And when I got there, it was a terribly emotional experience for me because I got off a train and I was by myself. I had my orders that had been given to me from another city and told to report to such and such an army headquarters in Frankfurt. And I was on the train all by myself. There were lots of other soldiers on the train, but we didn't know each other. We weren't going in a whole big unit. I was replacing someone in another unit that had to go home. And I got off the train within a few feet from where I'd last seen my family 7 years earlier. And of course, by then, the SS and the SA uniforms weren't there, and the swastika flags weren't flying around, and they weren't marching around. And these were now hungry, cold, depressed people shuffling around, looking for handouts, looking for food, looking for cigarettes. Excuse me. And when I look at these people, I would wonder who were the Nazis and who were the killers, who were responsible for these terrible things that had taken place in these concentration camps, who were the ones that killed my parents or people like them. And you look these people straight in the face, and of course none of them would ever tell you that they had been Nazis. It was never their fault. They had worked on a farm, they had worked in an office. Nobody ever did anything wrong. They were all good people. And then I got out on the street and I saw all this terrible destruction. Frankfurt had been very badly destroyed. There was nothing but rubble. For miles, you could absolutely not see a building standing. And again, it was an extremely emotional kind of feeling for me because on one hand, I was delighted that these people were getting retribution. Not enough, of course, but they were being punished in a little way for what they had done. But on the other hand, I had a most wonderful childhood in the city and had a most wonderful time until all these terrible things took place. So very mixed emotions. Anyway, I stayed in Germany for a whole year and did my tour of duty with the Army. And have I talked long enough?
That's fine.
And came back here. Came back to the United States, and I went to college, and then settled down in Dayton, Ohio.
Where did you go to college?
At Kent State University.
That's
Northern
rather
Ohio.
notorious.
Right, but long before
Right.
these things happened. It was a very nice liberal arts school, and I got my degree there. And then I settled in Dayton, Ohio, and raised a family. I have a wife and 2 children. My children are now living in Chicago. My son is a lawyer with he's a partner with a large law firm. My daughter is a physical therapist, supervisor at the Rehabilitation Institute in Chicago. And I took my kids back to Germany a few years ago, and I wanted them to see where my roots were. A lot of people don't want to go back or ever went back. But my philosophy on this was a little different. I felt that after all, Hitler only lasted 12 years. We are still here, and we have family and roots that go back hundreds of years. I have a family tree that's older than the United States of America. It goes back well over 200 years. And we had homes there, and my father had a business there, and my grandparents and great-grandparents have graves there, and I wanted my kids to see all this. And I wanted them to realize that we had roots somewhere. We didn't just come from nowhere. And while you can go there, you don't have to fall in love with the German people. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. Although I did talk in schools in Germany, and I'd still do that here a great deal, talk to kids in schools. I talked to several schools and then went back another year after. And I found that the kids, actually, I kept telling the kids, they always ask questions, are we being held responsible? How do we fit into this picture? They all have a guilt feeling.
The German kids.
German kids, I'm talking about German kids. And I always try to tell them that I have no quarrel with this generation or even the one before that. They can't possibly be held responsible for what their grandparents did. I don't want to have anything to do with the people my age or a little bit older. But the youngsters, the only thing they should be held responsible for is to see that these things never happen again. And obviously, not the Germans in particular, but other people aren't doing a very good job in this. But they were always very polite and very interested, I must say. And I also took my kids to Auschwitz. And
How long ago?
What?
How long ago?
This was about 4 years ago. And I wanted them to see where their grandparents had perished. I wanted to see Auschwitz myself, not because it's such a beautiful place. It's the most terrifying place when you go there. If you haven't been there, it's hard to believe what you see there. But I felt this is something I had to do, and I wanted my kids to see it and have it etched in their mind for the rest of their lives to see where their grandparents perished. Because by seeing it directly, I think it's something that something you'll never ever forget. So we all went there and saw it. Anyhow, I live in Ohio now, and I teach the Holocaust very often. I tell my story to kids in schools. We have a very active Holocaust center in Dayton, and we have a very large Air Force museum, and the Air Force Museum now has the Holocaust exhibit, and it's going to be there permanently. And we have a beautiful auditorium, and we have hundreds of kids every week. We've had now for the last few months coming there, and we talk about it. There are several other people besides myself that do this. Okay, that's
Thank you very much.
If you have any questions, go ahead.
Do you have grandchildren?
Yes, we have one grandchild. It's about 6 months old, 7 months old.
Mm-hmm. What was it like for your children when you took them to Germany?
It was quite an emotional experience. They took it very well. We have always talked about it. We never made a big issue out of it. Over many years, very little was ever said about the Holocaust. But of course, in the last few years, and especially since they've been grown up, we talk about it. They know the exact story. So it was an emotional experience for them, but it didn't come as a shock to them to see and hear all these things.
Does your wife have a similar background at all?
No, my wife was born in Montreal, Canada. Well, she lived with her family, her mother and father and sister. And she had lost a lot of members of her family, but not her immediate family during the war. In other words, there were many members of her family that were in Eastern Europe, Russia and Poland, that they lost.
I'm just looking through here, sort of working way back. If your parents did not survive the war, was it difficult to raise children without parents of your own?
Raise children? For me to raise children? You mean for me to raise children?
Yeah, just the fact that your parents...
No, I don't think so. As I say, we sort of compartmentalize, you might say, our lives and not let that interfere and ruin the rest of our lives and worrying about it or dwelling on it or anything like that. We went on with our lives. But when by going on, I don't mean that we forgot. I didn't forget my family. But at the same time, I didn't want to place any kind of burdens of that nature on my children by telling them, look, you come from a family of survivors and all that type of business. You know what I'm saying? I don't know, but are you you are a K2?
Yeah.
So you might have had similar experiences.
Well, my mother talked about it very little, which is also very typical.
Mm-hmm.
So she would basically, she just said that she was very lucky, which she was, but she is not one to dwell on the past or to talk about the past.
Mm-hmm.
So there was very little talk about it. And how is your Jewish identity now? How do you how do you observe or whatever?
My identity is probably more positive now than it ever was before in observing holidays and attending services. My wife came from a more Orthodox background than I did, and maybe that helped a little bit too. We attend services very regularly, and we don't have a kosher home, but sort of semi-kosher, you might say. We have separation of milchig and fleshig and dishes, and but it's very difficult now in Dayton to obtain kosher foods, kosher meats, I should say. So we have a little bit of difficulty in doing that. But I'm very active in our synagogue, and I'm very active in our Jewish Federation and various projects, and do a lot of things that, now that I'm retired, that I have never done before.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just skimming through here to see, because you've said a lot. Do you ever have feelings that what you went through wasn't so bad, that what others went through was so much worse?
Yes,
yeah,
definitely. I think I sort of explained that.
Yeah, you did. On the other hand, you lost your whole family.
I know. I mean, of course, that is the most terrible thing that can happen to you, losing your family. But, and it always leaves a mark on you, whether you like it or not.
And you say how you stayed in touch with your foster family. Mm-hmm. And what about those two boys who were, those two German boys?
One of them was in the Royal Air Force and was in a plane crash and died, the younger one. The older one I haven't heard from in a long time. He went to Oxford and then became very prominent. He was the head of the IBM Corporation in the United Kingdom.
Oh my.
Yeah, he did very well for himself. And I did see him once, but haven't had too much contact with him.
Okay, I'm just looking back here. What do you remember about your arrival in the United States?
It was very... There's little to say. I arrived and I lived with my aunt and uncle. And I went to school and started working. I went to night school, and then I went in the army. And after that I had my GI Bill of Rights, which meant I got my tuition paid for, which helped me because I certainly wouldn't have had enough money to go to college. So that was a great help.
Backwards in time here. Let's explain about England. Answered all these things. How did you learn English? I guess you picked it up eventually. Was that hard?
No, well, I not picked it up, of course, but the people I lived with were very meticulous in our learning a good English. You can tell by my English that it's may not be flawless, but it certainly is grammatically correct, and I don't have any very little German accent. And they saw to it that they wanted us to speak a good English because they hated the Germans, of course, and they didn't want anybody in the house, they told us, that had a German accent. So they saw to it that we learned proper English.
And did you bring any special mementos from Germany to England? Anything special you brought with you?
Some paper documents, which I'm going to send you if you want them. I have the complete list of the items that I was allowed to take with me. It's about 8 pages long, which I've discovered since the war. They were in the archives in Wiesbaden. And in those days, if you didn't list everything from a toothbrush to a coat hanger, there was a possibility you would be rejected to go on the transport. Everything had to be listed. And they found the complete list. So I can send that to you if it's of any interest to you.
I'll find out. I mean, I'm sure it is. I'll
Okay.
find out where are good places for them, right?
Okay.
And oh, here. When did you first hear about the concentration camps?
Not until 1945, almost at the end of the war, when the Russians started liberating the camps. And then, of course, Americans and British also did, but not until then. There may have been a few. It's blinking. It's blinking. Does that mean?
Do you think it means? It wasn't blinking the whole time?
I don't think so.
It's still going. I think it's off. I think it's fine. What is it? Still going. I think it's yeah. Oh, I think the battery's running out. I think that's what it's saying. All right. Well, we got plenty on here.
Okay.
It's flashing. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think we covered. Okay, now off.